It is my privilege, really, and pleasure to present to you Robert Bosnak, a longtime colleague of mine and a dear friend. Robert Bosnak is an internationally noted Jungian psychoanalyst with 45 years of experience. He pioneered Embodied imagination method that is being used worldwide for psychotherapy, medical healing. He's the author of multiple books, including the classic Little Course in Dreams, appearing in 12 languages. Robbie is a long-time contributor to Pacifica's educational community, and of particular note was his organizing and keynoting two conferences here on the imagination of medicine. Birthed out of those conferences was our collaboration in creating the Santa Barbara Healing Sanctuary, which Robbie continues its work to this day, both here in the United States and in Mexico. Which brings us to imagination and technology. Can you imagine a healing sanctuary modeled after the Asclepian healing temples of yesteryear, replicated today in virtual and mixed reality, offering simulated environments for folks worldwide to participate in? Can you see that, into that? Can you also imagine hearing Robbie incubating these ideas further in a rather large RV on the way to Burning Man? I can see that you saw that more easily. Well, that's just what happened. For the last years, Robbie has come to Burning Man dressed impeccably and mindfully as an alchemist from the future. So just imagine that. Each day, as his costume evolved, so did he. He offered accounts from the worlds of tomorrow as he journeyed through the art installations and music venues themed appropriately. 2 years ago, iRobot, and last year, Metamorphosis. So for many years, I have admired Robbie Bosnak's creativity, unique genius, wickedly creative mind, and soul, both in the classroom and on the playa. Perhaps it was, particularly on the playa, I might add. Perhaps it was in the dawn, watching the sun come up, after dancing all night to the pulsing music of Roboheart, that the vision presented itself. Because mirrored reality has a sense of place, offered the alchemist, virtual healing sanctuaries will be possible for everyone to experience. And where better to begin that process of development and implementation, we agreed, than an Academy of Imaginal Arts and Sciences located here on the campuses of Pacifica Graduate Institute, which we'll talk about a bit later. Indeed, cyberspace has started dreaming, and who better to tell how than the alchemist himself? Will you please welcome Robbie Bosnak?
Thank you so much, Steve. What am I going to talk about? It's always a surprise to me what I'm going to be talking about. I first want to talk about him, C.G. Jung, because much of the proceedings here have been under his look, and one of the things that I don't like about Jung is that he always thinks in polarities. He thinks in things that oppose each other, that are like archetypes and algorithms, or like technophobes and technophiles, and then it comes together in some kind of Venn diagram in the middle. I am not of that ilk. I'm not that interested in opposing forces. I'm interested in multiplicity. And in the work that I'm doing, Embodied Imagination, we have people embody up to 5 or 6 different states simultaneously and see how that affects the body. So I am neither a technophobe nor a technophile. I'm tech curious. And I want to start with a quote, not from him, but from Abraham Lincoln, who wrote that the patent system added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things. So Lincoln believes that we are actually creating more in times that are more adverse. We become more creative. The genius gets stronger in times that are more adverse, and we feel and we know that we are in very adverse times at the moment, as we have been at any point in history. At times we're always adverse. And so it is an enormous creation of genius that is coming in. Most of you will know me by my, some of you. Some of you, blah, 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 blah. Some of you will know me by my day job. I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst, and I've done psychotherapy since 1971, and been involved with dreaming since then. And Pat and I were in Zurich at the same time, so I want to, she's here for another 20 minutes, so I want to say the most important things in the beginning. And, but I want to tell you a little bit about my personal journey through imagination and technology, because we came upon this at Burning Man through where I walk around as a lunatic. And because I like my analyst, one of my analysts, I have three analysts, one of my analysts was called Adolf Guggenbuhl Craig. And Guggenbuhl was really irritated with the notion of the wise old man. That really set him off. And he wrote a book called The Old Fool. And that's where I feel more at home, as the old fool. Now, my relationship to technology started in 1967, so 52 years ago, when I learned computer programming, and became interested in what you could do with computer programming. At the time, I was a criminologist, and the computers were, I was at Leiden University, the computers were a whole floor of the university building of the Computational Institute. And there were people making punch cards, and we were trying to write programs for it. For those of you who remember, that was PL1 and Fortran. Right? It was a very old language that by now is probably studied by people that study antiquity. And so I became very interested in, and then I got sick and I moved away from it, and I moved to the Jung Institute, and that's where we started to work more. But I lost a little bit of touch with computer programming and technology, though I always stayed very interested, particularly interested in virtual reality, which in the 1980s had this promise of direct retinal display, which would mean that it would be directly, the image would be directly painted on your retina, and therefore you would get a large enough space in front of you that you feel that you're inside of it. So I was very interested in that. But what I was most interested in, and that is why I wanted you to be here, was in 1983, I organized a conference called Facing Apocalypse. Facing Apocalypse was my first foray into organizing a conference about imagination and technology. The apocalyptic imagination in 1983, as it is now, was particularly strong. And when we did the conference in 1983, and it was well attended, and James Hillman talked in it, and we were talking about how every generation wants to believe that they live at the end of times because that makes them really important. And it was attended very well by people like Claiborne Pell at the time, who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. And he said, why don't we do this in Moscow? And I immediately said, yeah, let's do it in Moscow. So, and he could make all the connections, and it ended up in Moscow about 9 years later, but it ended up there. And so I went to the microphone and I said, in 1986, we're going to do a conference about facing apocalypse and about the nuclear technology and the nuclear issue in Moscow. And people ran up to me afterwards and said, in 1986, we're going to be in nuclear winter. There's not going to be a world anymore. And so that very powerful notion of apocalypse, which apocalypse has these two things in it, right? It is both the notion of the end of the world, and it is the notion of revelation. So we get this revelation of the end of the world, and it's very convincing, especially when there are times of troubles, and we are in times of troubles. There are climate deniers that are led by the stable genius. But that I'm not talking about. I'm talking about that there is a force of imagination that underlies technology, that is a force of apocalypticism and what it went on. And then we found in the 1980s that Gorbachev was using the word 2000 more and more and more often. So it was in 2000, I think, we did a conference, a Facing Apocalypse conference, about the environment and about the apocalypse of the Soviet Union, which happened a year later. So you can actually, the more people were talking about the year 2000, the more we felt that the apocalyptic fumes were rising. So now the advantage of coming of age, and I come of age, I'm turning 72, is that you can look back. And I want to look back at the apocalypticism of my day and see what happened to it, because we can look back at it. And this is from Andrew McAfee, who wrote about this, and he writes very well about these things. We can look back at the apocalypticism of the latter part of the 3rd century. So let's look at two telling examples. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich published the bestseller, The Population Bomb, some of you may remember, in which he warned of acute future food shortages. Early editions of the book began, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." Well, his predictions carried out about population growth. Global population increased from 3 to 4 million between 1959 and 1974, and billions were added in 15, 12, and 11 years subsequent afterward. But mass starvation largely did not occur. Instead, the opposite happened. People all around the world became better nourished. In 1968, only Northern America, Europe, and Oceania supplied their people with an average of at least 2,500 calories a day, which is assumed for us to stay alive in a good way. And as recently as 1980, the world average was still below this number, but yet by 2005, every region in the world had met this standard. So that is the way apocalypticism works. At the time, everybody believed it. Everybody believed that we were going to run out of food and that this was going to be the ultimate disaster. And this is what came out. Another one that's very interesting, and I know that one because our Dutch queen was very interested in this. The Club of Rome was very interested in this. In 1972, a team of computer modelers at MIT, led by Donella Meadows, published The Limits of Growth. I'm sure that some of you remember that. Another blockbuster. Their simulations found that unchecked exponential growth in populations and economies was bound to cause a massive global crash of resource depletion somewhere during the 21st century. Even under the most optimistic scenarios, she writes, or they write, the Club of Rome writes, known global reserves of gold would be used within 29 years, so this is 1972. Silver in 42 years, copper and petroleum in 50 years, and aluminum in 55 years. Now, these predictions were not accurate at all. We have gold and silver large reserves, in fact, much bigger than in 1972, despite almost half a century of additional consumption. Known global reserves of gold are about 400% larger than today, than in 1972. Silver reserves are 200% larger, and the known reserves of aluminum is 25 times as high as they were in the early 70s. So these predictions are all based on apocalypticism, and we have to be aware that apocalypticism is very potent. That doesn't mean that we have to deny that we have problems, because it is the problems that are going to trigger this. But if we add to the apocalypticism, the result of it will be that people are going to say, I cannot do anything about this anymore. And they will just burn out. And so I'm very worried about apocalypticism, and I love what James Hillman said at the end of the conference, the Facing Apocalypse conference. He said, because we were all talking about we are the generation that has to do it. You remember that the nuclear clock from the nuclear scientists was 6 minutes to midnight. And Helen Caldicott was telling us that if we don't change this before Reagan gets elected, it's over, game's over. And I'm not here to praise Reagan. But I think that these kind of notions make people sit like, oh, I can't do it. So we have to realize that there is an imagination always underlying technology, and an important imagination is the apocalyptic imagination. And Jim said in the end, when we were talking about all this end of the world stuff, he said, isn't continuity enough? And I think that that's really important. Isn't continuity enough? That this may not be the end of the world, these may be dire times, but the end of the world, no, I don't think so. So I was also an early adopter of the internet. In 1997, we created Cyberdreamwork. Cyberdreamwork was the first platform that where people could work together on dreams and on imagination. And so that was in the stone age of the internet, 1997. And we had groups that are still running after 22 years of same group running, working their dreams. And so there are extraordinary things that can be done with technology. And then we got very involved, and I just want to point to this briefly. We became very involved in emotion recognition. We were interested in how a computer could recognize emotion, and we did this at the MIT Media Lab. And we found that there was a dream where a character would walk into a room, and this was an old man. And the graph, and we worked purely with galvanic skin responses, because then you just get one signal. When you work with brains, you get 15 signals at the same time, and you don't know what to do with it. But the graph would go in a particular way. So we would look at the form of the graph. And then we found that later in the dream, when we had the person with the GSR, the same signature of GSR responses happened when the same character would enter. So we found that this is an important finding, but the problem was the computers were too slow, because we had to find in real time pattern recognition from finding patterns in the graphs to see which emotions looked alike. So I think it could be done now, but I lost interest. Now we thought that all these things that, like emotion recognition, that would come soon. You remember that by now we are 20 years past our first trip to Jupiter in 2001. And it's something that I call the telescope effect that happens in technology. And the telescope effect is that we believe that things will come much quicker than they actually do. And I think that was the basis of the dot-com crisis in 2000, when we were expecting these things to happen tomorrow, where actually maybe they're beginning to happen now. There is one thing that we used to do in Zurich a lot, and that is to look at stories as they are unfolding and what they mean psychologically. So now I'm looking at technology and I'm going to see what the imagination is in it. Now, when I look at the imagination in a particular technology, it is not that I'm saying that the technology itself is not literal, right? We're talking about literal technology. What I am interested in, as is everybody now, because it's all over the news, that Google has claimed that they have a quantum computer that has reached quantum supremacy, which means that it can now do calculations that conventional computers no longer can. And so I am not going to tell you what quantum computing is, because I have no idea, but I can I understand a tiny little bit of it, and it started with Richard Feynman, or one of the founders of it, and he began to wonder if the quantum phenomena, there is a quantum problem, and that is that if you don't look at something, it actually doesn't exist. It comes into existence by looking at it. And Feynman thought that this thing in quantum theory, if you don't look at it, it doesn't exist. This is the notion of Schrödinger's cat, right? Where if you don't look, you don't know if the cat's alive or dead. This could be used for quantum computing. And so there are, quantum computing doesn't work with a binary system. It goes faster than conventional computing because it uses quantum entanglement, which does not have the bottleneck of the speed of light, because when something happens to one electron here, something happens to spooky action at a distance, happens to an electron over there. So it could speed up dramatically, but the most interesting thing about it for us as students of the imagination is the notion of superposition. Now I have to describe to you what is superposition, because my idea is that this notion of superposition is very similar to what we call unconscious. So that we are now not dealing with two states, 0 and 1. The quantum computer deals with three states, 0, 1, and unconscious. Because the unconscious state is, if you don't look, I'm not there. That is what it's working with, and that is superposition. And The quantum computer can use the collection of qubits, which are its bits, to correct its own mistakes. But the basic thing is that we are now dealing with a computer that is going to be based on 3 states: 0, 1, and so as we are dealing with these 3 states, it's not just going to be a faster. If we look at it from the perspective of the imagination in it, this is an imagination of 3. We're no longer in a binary world when we look at quantum computing. I may be completely wrong, but this is the way that I look at it when I look at it from the perspective of imagination. This is an imagination of 3. And I think that will eventually influence our world dramatically, because it's no longer an imagination of 2. It is the imagination of 0, 1, and unknown. Now we come to what I actually want to talk about. But I wanted to get this over with so that Pat could hear it. What I'm talking about is, and one of my loves is this thing called Wired magazine. I am a great lover of Wired magazine and of its founder, Kevin Kelly. And I remember that I said to you, we should get Kevin Kelly here. And then you checked, and it would be so many thousands of dollars that each one of us probably would have to pay like $600 just to hear him. So that was out. But he brought up in Wired of March of this year the notion that's not his notion, the notion of the mirror world. And I want to go into the mirror world. Bye, Pat. See ya. I want to go into the notion of the mirror world that he brings in through Henri Corbin. And I thank you that you brought Corbin up. And I knew Corbin in the 70s. And I had a dream that I've spoken about several times that I brought to Corbin, and I want to start there. This dream was a dream of a white city. So you have to now imagine. We are at Eranos. There was a room there that is called the Chambre Copte. The Chambre Copte was a place with Coptic furniture. It was right next to James Hillman's study. That's where Henri Corbin would be. And he, for some reason that I still don't know, he liked me. And he manifested that he liked you by taking his hearing aid out and putting it on the table, right? So he put the hearing aid between us, and I said, Professor, I've had this dream and I need to talk with you about it. And he got really interested. I said, I'm walking along a river and I see across from the river a city, and it's all white with cupolas, and it's white and it's very attractive, and I dive in and I swim to the other side, and it's a white city. And it is Moorish or it is Arabic, I don't know. I don't know what era I'm in. I see people walk around in Arabic garb. And the city itself feels hyper-real. It feels not just real, but hyper-real. It feels so real that I can viscerally sense it. Now, I'm walking around and then I wake up and Corbin says to me, you were there because this city exists. It's called the White City. And the White City in Islam would be called Alam al-Mithal, And the Alam al-Mithal, he translated as the Mundus Imaginalis, because, of course, Corbin was a scholar, and he liked Latin. And so let's move away for a moment from the notion of Mundus Imaginalis. It was a world said to be a world of similitudes, and therefore it was a look-alike world. It was a look-alike world, and Eric, you've said how it was an in-between, an intermediary and an intermediate world. Go back to his lecture. It's a perfect description of it, so I don't have to do that. And in this world of similitudes, everything that is there is a similitude. It is not literal. It is, and that's very important to when you work on a dream, because I spend my life living in this world of similitudes and in this world of dreams, and I have been trying to calculate that I probably have worked like 40,000 dreams in my life, so I've spent a lot of time in that world of similitude. And the first thing that you notice when you're in that world of similitude is that in this world of lookalikes, in this simulation, when you're in this simulation, this dream simulation, you realize, the first thing you realize is that everything is real. Everything appears entirely real. And this appearance of reality, that is, as a phenomenologist, what I take to be my first criterion. It is a real world. And you start to move around in this world, and I meet my brother. And I have a conversation with my brother. If I then call him up, and he lives in Holland, and I say to him, remember that conversation that we had? He will not know what I'm talking about, because I was not talking to him, I was talking to his similitude. I was talking to his likeness. And Corbin describes the Alam al-Mithal in the following way. It's a world of subtle bodies, and it is, I'll just read this little piece of Corbin. In short, this is a world of subtle bodies, of which it is indispensable to have some notion in order to understand that there is a link between pure spirit and material body. Their mode of being is therefore described as being in suspense. Like that of the image or form, this mode of being constitutes its own matter and is independent of the substratum to which it is immanent, as if by accident. So it is not made of where it appears, it has a place of appearance. And so this becomes really important when we look at technology. We're talking about a place of appearance, and the comparison regularly used by our authors, which were the Sufi sheikhs that he studied, is the mode in which images in suspense appear and subsist in a mirror. The material substance of the mirror, whether metal or mineral, is not the substance of the image. The image could be only accidentally of the same substance. The substance is simply the place of its appearance. Now, let me tell you something that I had the experience of the virtual reality walking the plank that we were just told about. You are stepping out, you're in this virtual world, you're stepping out and you're walking a plank and you are like 30 stories above the ground. Now, this is not as real as a lucid dream, not at all. You can still see pixels. It looks like a cartoon, but here I'm walking on this plank. I can feel my body become scared. I begin to shake. And I move forward like this, very slowly, very slowly. I know that I am in a room here at Pacifica. I walk really slowly, but I'm on a plank. And below me is the world, and if I fall, I will be dead. Now, my mind knows that this is not true, but my whole body begins to shake. It is a fully embodied experience. And then he says, step off, and I just hesitate and hesitate. I don't dare, and finally I go, and it feels like when I did skydiving, it feels like, and so I go down. So it's an entirely embodied experience. This world of virtual and mixed reality is an entirely embodied experience. So what is happening is that we're moving out of a world, the cyber world, that is disembodied, into a world that has become fully embodied. And I'm interested in the embodied imagination. So what are the possibilities that we can do with this kind of technology? And we hear, I know that at Walter Reed Institute, where they work with soldiers, they're using it for PTSD, as we were told. But I just want for a moment to talk about this mirror world, and this mirror world according to Kevin Kelly. And I am at a loss of time. How much do you have? 5 more minutes? 5. Okay. So I will be very brief about that. And I wanted to say something that is related to what Aliyah was saying. And that is that there are brain changes that are happening to people who are the first inhabitants, the first indigenous people in this virtual world, the I generation. And she noted studies that the brain is changing. Well, of course the brain is changing. We're moving into a completely different world. We're moving into a world where there is an instant adaptation to that world. We don't know how that adaptation should be. So of course the brain's going to change. We shouldn't be all alarmed about that. We should try and limit it and let it go slow. But we have to realize that we are the adapting animal. We've adapted really well. And at the moment, we're not adapting too well, but we've adapted really well over a long period of time. And so Kevin Kelly, and I can very much advise that you read this, has come up with this notion of the mirror world that already existed, where Google Maps is creating a 3-dimensional world that we can all eventually move through, and that will have a sense of place, where everything will have a sense of place, like walking the plank had a sense of place to it. Now, when something has a sense of place to it, it can be used for dream incubation. I have taken people to many places in the world, to the caves in France and to Iceland and to many different places to see how people dream. So to connect this notion of the virtual world with the imaginal world, because we're both talking about a dream, about a world of mirror. And so can we use this mirror world that is now being created for dream incubation so that we begin to merge this world of the third, this world that Corbin is talking about, and this world of virtuality that actually is fully embodied. So it's an embodied virtual world. And I think that that is possible. I believe that it's possible. The first step should be that we are going to be together with a group, and I'm very interested in doing it, groups all over the world, if that is possible, with various people in a place that has a very strong sense of place. And then in that place to do dream incubation and see what kind of dreaming comes from that place. To not stay in our notion of, is it archetype or is it algorithm? By the way, talking about that, Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis is based on an algorithm. The algorithm was the algorithm of the Rosarium Philosophorum that was portrayed as the marriage of sun and moon, which was the algorithm, the search engine made in the 16th century, the search engine to find the information of alchemy, because there was so much information that you had to have a search engine in it, and Sergey Brin would recognize it immediately as a sorting program. So I want to get out of the oppositional thinking, and I want to go and see what happens when we go into this space that is fully embodied, where we feel that we are somewhere, where we feel that we are together with people from all different places, and that we can then see what the dreaming brings there, and maybe that will inform us further. The next step would be what Steve and I are talking about. If we can do a healing sanctuary, I'm doing healing sanctuaries. I'm going tomorrow morning to Mexico to do another healing sanctuary where we use this dreaming for the healing process. So that would be the next step. And I have to disclose that I'm very interested in doing things globally because my wife lives in Sydney and I live here and I'm a commuter. So I'm very interested in seeing what happens when you bring people from different places together in a new place, because there's now such a sense of embodied place that we can start using it and seeing what happens when dreaming happens there, not in the caves of France, but in this embodied environment, and see what dreaming does to that. Okay, any ideas, questions, notions?